Kieren, for those of you who don't know him, he's been, I guess, in the space for a long time, I think BlockApps, we guys founded, was it 2014 or?
Technically 2016. We were working on it in 2015.
Yeah. BlockApps, they have their Strato platform, which is one of the leading enterprise blockchain platforms. But also, I think was it this week that the news came out about a new sustainability based network that you'd launched as well. So it's certainly it's great to have you here to kind of tie up with that too and learn more about it.
Thanks very much. Yes, technically official announcement I think was a week and a half ago.
So I'll hand over to you now, Kieren.
Thanks everyone for attending. Here to talk about TraceCarbon, which is Connor mentioned, is a new blockchain network that we've deployed, and with a focus on sustainability. So that said, I'll kind of dive into an overview of our company and then the problem that we're aiming to solve and how we solve it. So who are we? We consider ourselves one of the leaders in enterprise blockchain. And the definition of enterprise blockchain has sort of changed over the years, but for us, it really aligns with the original and current EEA mandate. We see Ethereum as a general technology platform applicable both to the kind of public network and cryptocurrency oriented use cases, and then increasingly DeFi, NFTs. It's all in the news. We all know that. Lately, we have never worked with the cryptocurrency aspects directly. Have always been focused on sort of business to business problems of different types. So very early on, technical considerations, permissioning, privacy, how do you allow parties to interact and transact with each other without putting all of the data on the public ledger, and performance in certain enterprise workloads, but also how to integrate very easily with the existing enterprise IT stack. So we turned out that very early on in the history of the EEA, there were many big enterprises who had these requirements and that sort of mission as well, and a handful of other tech companies who created platforms to solve those needs. So we're one of them. We're on the founding board of the EEA, along with again some really big companies, JP Morgans of the world, and a handful of other startups. So I want to talk about sustainability, and specifically, there's just a huge uptick in sustainability activity really in the last year that I've noticed. I'm fond of quoting the statistic that over the last decade, if you look at the S&P 500, in 2011, 20% put out a sustainability report, and today about 90% do. So I'm sure it's been happening, and it wasn't something that I was all that aware of, let's say 5 years ago. But it's really, this is clearly the moment. There is just tremendous demand from all sides to understand the sustainability picture, particularly big companies. So from the investor side, it's very challenging to get data supporting the sustainability claims that companies are making. You've got companies like BlackRock out there creating ETFs of companies that they see as green or more sustainable, green ETFs. But there isn't all that much confidence in what are the sustainability claims people are making, what do those mean, how do we compare them on a standardized basis? Similarly, just the metrics, right? Yeah, so how do people agree on how to measure sustainability in sort of a similar way as, let's say, GAAP? So you can measure the financial performance of companies in a very standard way, and that's typically required by the regulators and exchanges. So for instance, for public companies, there isn't so much of an analog for sustainability right now. It's all voluntary disclosures, and the way to there isn't a great closed loop between the underlying data and the claims that companies are making. So yeah, a little more on sustainability reporting challenges, focusing in particular on carbon, CO2 equivalent emissions, let's say. companies need a secure record that traces back to the source from an activity perspective of what did they do, what did they emit, and how can they break that down by category of activity across a very complex ecosystem. So we're seeing that business is much more interconnected than it was even 10 years ago, but there's been a big trend away from vertical integration and towards companies relying on a very big and complex network of suppliers, so complex operational ecosystem. What that means is that it's become very challenging to figure out how to attribute activity across your value chain. So who of your 10,000 vendors do you attribute your footprint on a particular activity to? How do they reconcile with you? It's become extremely complicated, just operationally, but when added to sustainability reporting, there's this just huge challenge today. So companies are estimating their emissions on a forward-looking basis. They need to reconcile against what it actually occurs after, say they're projecting for multiple years. How do they perform against those projections? That's a process that needs to be implemented and is often not implemented. And the provenance, right? In that complex ecosystem, what are all the sources? Are they internal? Are they from your external value chain? How do you calculate that? So the reporting is very manual right now. It's resource intensive. It's not standardized. There are a number of competing standards out there. We'll talk more about that. And ultimately, it comes back to the shareholder side. I'll go into the in the news part shortly, and public trust. It's becoming a requirement, especially for really big companies. So just a couple examples here. Exxon, new members have joined their board. They're pushing very hard in an activist manner. So they're coming from the board and the shareholder side, the legal regulatory side. So this was in late May. Shell was actually compelled by a court to cut emissions faster than the targets that it was projecting. So we're kind of seeing Europe generally has a little bit more, it's moving faster in Europe than the United States. Obviously, BlockApps were in the United States, but it's happening all over. You're seeing, for instance, there are actual carbon taxes in Europe where the US does not have them. But it's really moving. It's in all sectors. So, the oil and gas companies are very big emitters, but, folks like Pepsi are making big investments in sustainable manufacturing plants, for instance. You're seeing a lot of it in the news from Microsoft as well. They've been very public about their plans to get to negative carbon in the next, I think by 2030, they said. So, kind of more specifically, and this is not something that you can go Google necessarily. We're hearing a lot around the specifics of emission reductions from, as we've gone out to the market, we're hearing this as a very common problem. So companies are conservative in their reporting, and they are because they are worried that the methodology that they're using to calculate the emission reduction associated with, say, a new manufacturing technique that is less carbon intensive, or even in certain cases, a forecast from a offsetting carbon offset that they've purchased, maybe they'll even mark that down because they're not all that confident in the projection that external party laid out. We're seeing up to 50% cuts in the emission reduction estimates that the people are using. And that means that the reduction targets are getting met more slowly. And to say you wanted to get to net zero, you're a very large oil and gas company, for instance, if you were to do that just by market purchases of carbon offsets, for instance, this would double the number that you need to buy, and that number would be in the billions. So getting a handle on the data and the methodology around calculations, it's actually a really big problem. So kind of the why blockchain aspect of it. So, why do we see this as a technology that can help solve this very big, complicated sustainability problem? And, I think first and foremost, it comes down to data sharing and being able to share the data in a secure and auditable way between permissioned parties. So there's data sharing occurring today. All these companies have commercial agreements with each other. In some cases, I'm sure the calculation of the footprint is part of those commercial agreements, though we're not seeing that all over the place. There's always this attribution question. Again, if you are, you're doing some, let's say, construction job, and then you're leasing equipment to help with that construction job, you have to attribute the footprint of your usage kind of back to that company who leased the equipment to you. It's very complicated, and the standards are not spectacular around how that attribution should occur and how to do those calculations. So there are competing, it's all voluntary, these disclosures. So there are, at least in the United States, there are competing methodologies to do these calculations. A number of them, since there's Verra has a verified carbon standard, there's many others. And so what we see is the commonality is the activity that actually occurred, and we're somewhat agnostic on the output, which is the methodology, and the end number. And our system actually allows you to kind of mix and match between them. It needs to meet the enterprise IT stack where it is, and actually for BlockApps in particular, this has always been a strength of ours. Blockchain actually presents a really good picture for how, middleware, basically. So how do you get data from existing enterprise IT systems? And, to date, middleware has always been pretty much in the confines of one enterprise, and sometimes there are external messaging systems across them. What blockchain actually does is the same, but it allows the data model to evolve across parties. And so it's just much easier to add new functionality to existing systems while they're live and running compared to other choices. So finally, this allows, so having this flexibility and extensibility and reconciling all the data together really supports analytics and reporting. So on our side, we have integrations with traditional data stores that allow search and roll-ups and sort of aggregation use cases that give specific insights into the sustainability activity that's going on. That's hard to do. I suppose if you create an existing data warehouse, you can do this, but people are challenged again to wrangle all the existing data sources, especially across companies. And so it's been very challenging to get kind of big picture insights on sustainability to date. Okay, so into TraceCarbon. So TraceCarbon is an enterprise blockchain network that allows kind of compliance and transparency through the sort of CO2 emissions lifecycle with a focus on corporate reporting, which I've talked about, the project effectiveness, so the effectiveness of offsetting projects that people want to claim carbon offsets on, and also the product lifecycle. So through the manufacturing process, what kind of data can you attach to assess and prove the carbon footprint of particular products? We're actually seeing very generally, decommoditization. It's a term I've learned recently and like to use. Basically, not all, let's say, crude oil in its production process will have the same carbon intensity. There are technologies out there that make it less intensive versus more intensive. And companies that have better, lower carbon intensity crude should get credit for that. And so that means that fuel has to be sort of treated as less of a commodity than it is today. And that's part of the product lifecycle analysis feature. And it runs on so we very early on got away from proof of work as a consensus algorithm. I think the whole world seems to be moving that way. But our consensus algorithm is pretty light, all considered, and so it's fairly easy for us to neutralize the overall footprint of TraceCarbon. So it's on a net zero emission blockchain. It's kind of a picture of, if you are a company, what does your reporting requirements look like, and kind of where's your ecosystem? So there's this sort of 3 levels of reporting: scope 1, scope 3, scope 2. Scope 1 is your very direct. Scope 3 kind of is the broadest bucket, and that includes all of your end customer use of your products, all the products you've sourced, for instance, so upstream and downstream of you, and all of this contributes to your overall carbon footprint. And so if you think about how to actually organize the activity that you're reporting on, so how do you come to that overall CO2 equivalent emissions number? It works like this in the case of TraceCarbon. So the first step is to define activities. So, and the goal is, is this going to be a net emission or will it be an offset? There'll be a source. So that could be your operations, in a particular factory, for instance, if you're a manufacturing company, or it could be regional, it could be, in the Permian Basin as a big oil and gas firm, all of the activity you're doing there could be an airline flight, or, class of a set of airline flights. So it's really as granular as you like, and you can add sort of activities together in a sense to get to an overall footprint. And TraceCarbon basically has conversion methodology that both can be inputted by the end user, and it's all implemented as Solidity smart contracts, or if we have off-the-shelf calculations as well, which basically allow for the conversion to a CO2 equivalent footprint. So again, there's rules coming from like the EPA, for instance, gives you rules on how to do these conversions, but there are other sources as well as far as following that, the sort of provenance between the activity and the footprint. So once the activity is defined, you put events against that activity. So, first, if the activities of, flying on an airplane, the events are individual flights for which you can get reporting on the footprint itself. And dates and additional documentation, the ticket proving that the activity happened, etc. And then you can report on an internal level in addition to a public level. So once this data is sort of all reconciled, if you will, you can then break it down by source, by activity type, and publish reports in different formats that are standard both to be sort of shared internally, but potentially with the public as well. So moving along, this is only, TraceCarbon is only as useful as people using it. We'll talk quickly about a few of our launch partners. So the first partner we'll discuss is CarbonSig. CarbonSig is a tech company basically inside Oxy, Occidental Petroleum, in their low carbon ventures business unit. And their tagline is "Make emissions visible." And I think you'll see what that means shortly. So the idea is they want to add a signature or almost be like the DocuSign of carbon, if you will. So if you think about products, food products, they come, and this is by regulatory mandate, with a nutrition label. Other products, they may come with a manual, et cetera, but there isn't sort of a mandate on kind of what went into this from a emissions perspective. And so if you look on the right-hand side, sort of what you see is the overall business process and kind of chain of custody in a particular, in the end, this actually supported a shipment, but this is sort of a detailed calculation supported by TraceCarbon of the end carbon footprint of a particular process that they have in their manufacturing chain. And so the system allows them to kind of record what's happened, manage the offsets as sort of an additional detail, and transfer them to the appropriate parties. So kind of another example, so they actually did they believe, this was announced earlier this year, the world's first net negative shipment of a large a whole carrier full of crude oil. I believe the trading counterparty on this was Reliance, a very large oil and gas firm, and basically they tracked the whole manufacturing process, the intensity of the crude itself, also the footprint of the tanker, and they purchased the appropriate number of carbon offsets to neutralize and actually make net negative that transaction. And one of the outputs, of course, being a zero CO2 equivalent bottle. So that's carbon sync. We've also partnered with a startup called Fuel Trust, and Fuel Trust also has a focus on what's happening with the physical products, but it's kind of coming from more of an AI driven angle, and with all the focus on maritime actually. So maritime fuel is about 1/8 of the world's fuel consumption. So and most of the products we use eventually go over the water at some point. And so there are a number of initiatives around sustainable fuels, and some of these are voluntary, some of these are sort of UN oriented, but I'll mention the Sea Cargo Charter and the Poseidon Principles. These are actually focused on the financing side, where basically the really large backers of shippers who are trying to get their products to different countries typically, and the operators of the vessels themselves, they are in some cases lending with higher interest rates for firms that don't meet certain sustainability goals, and lower interest rates that do, and eventually will stop lending at all to those who don't meet sustainability targets. So when you've kind of got a tie-in with the financing side, then these things really have force, and people will very quickly have to adopt technology to meet those sustainability targets and report back on them, as we kind of covered earlier in the presentation. So what does Fuel Trust do specifically? So they kind of cross this complex value chain from fuel producers through midstream to suppliers, delivery, et cetera. And each step of the way, they're actually sort of digitally fingerprinting the actual fuel. So the fuel producers, for instance, they already have to collect a lot of data on kind of the chemical composition of fuel, and Fuel Trust is able to, fuels are not exactly the same. They're similar, but they're not a complete commodity product. They can actually tell that, oh, that fuel that showed up later in the value chain is probably from, big producer X, or it's an admixture between big producer A and B. And often when we're talking to partners, prospective customers, we get this question like, okay, so the blockchain's great. I see that it creates a digital single source of truth across an industry. What do we do if the data in is no good? And Fuel Trust is sort of a partial answer to that question. They can actually fingerprint the fuel physically, which helps augment the value of the data that's in the blockchain. That's another data point. As the transaction sort of is followed across the parties in the chain, they also have a physical checkpoint and evaluation at each step as you go. So I've kind of covered this a little bit, but so they kind of assess the carbon potential of fuels, especially as they're blended and produced, using an AI-based system. They also, so going back to the point on the, say, EPA standards, they are able to look at the fuel and say, oh, okay, so the EPA process predicts this level of CO2 equivalent footprint, but given what we know, we actually think you've done 5% better, 10% better. The EPA sort of estimate is kind of the most conservative possible. And so companies are not actually getting credit for the additional carbon reduction that they're doing, and their downstream customers tend to not be getting that credit as well, without a system like Fuel Trust that allows them to kind of understand from the physical material itself the reduction in footprint. And so that's all on the kind of direct carbon visibility side, and there are positive impacts downstream. So again, in Europe, there are carbon tax filings. There's just the reporting on the sort of pre and post in the value chain emissions reporting, and all the way through to the consumer, you get a better sense of the kind of overall ESG footprint of the product that you're buying. And also, there's potentially fraud in fuels. The admixture might not be what you expected as a customer somewhere in the value chain, and Fuel Trust helps with that problem as well, again, due to the ability to sort of physically fingerprint the fuel. So kind of bringing it home here. In sustainability, people are looking for understanding in a chaotic environment in which there's a lot of activity across lots of different businesses, lots of data sources, and there's not a consistent methodology for these calculations. There's sort of very low traceability and not a lot of trust. So what we're achieving with TraceCarbon is kind of a clear provenance of activity and the data associated with it, secure sharing of that, of course, automation of the whole life cycle of reporting, and ultimately greater public trust and trust in the eyes of investors as well. So, you know, if, again, I think we've got more of a tech audience, but if you think of yourself as someone at a company that has a substantial carbon footprint, this is really kind of what it looks like. So you are in a complex ecosystem that, you know, has lots of different parties, and it all has to work at the end of the day. You understanding your overall footprint, what went into your products, how effective the actions to reduce your footprint are. And that is it for today. So thanks very much. I'm Kieren. BlockApps. John Chappell, also listed here, is kind of the guy who works on the energy vertical for us. So folks can get in touch with him as well.
I'm certainly interested as well to know, of course, we're dealing with a lot of data here, right? And there's, you know, one side, there's the, you know, the blockchain absolutely, you know, makes sense in terms of providing the, you know, that trust layer between these different organizations. The other side is, of course, you don't want to store everything, you know, in a blockchain, as you know, as we all know. So kind of how is the data kind of managed in that regard? Because there's you know, there is the potential for there to be quite large amounts of information there, and you know, is there kind of some other pieces to the puzzle, so to speak, outside the actual network there that are kind of key enablers for it?
Yeah, it's a great question, and let me give you a kind of our general philosophy. The first is to try to meet the data where it is. So there are a lot of systems out here that out in the market that allow you to say calculate your footprint, but really they're mostly key in. So you're largely typing information on an activity that you did and assigning a footprint, and it adds it up for you. So where possible, we're pulling the data from existing sources. So the ERP to look at all your financial transactions and kind of assign a footprint for those. That helps with the scope 3. Let's say project management systems. You know, if you know all the activity you did in a particular carbon remediating project, you want to at least pull all those events in so that you can have a footprint associated with it. Ultimately, the granularity, it needs to be about as granular as you want to prove, so to speak. So, you know, it's not as if IoT devices are, you know, millions of them are pinging TraceCarbon every 15 minutes, right? Ultimately, you want to collect that data, but what goes into TraceCarbon is enough granularity to prove the claim that you're trying to make. And it doesn't really need to be that much more. You know, there's always operational systems of different types that are supporting these claims from a data perspective, and TraceCarbon is kind of tracking that again through the value chain. But it's not as if someone downstream of you wants to inspect every data point that you collected. It's sort of enough that you can prove what you're trying to say, and you know, some sort of linkage back if people really need to see more data to support that claim to some other operational data store potentially. But typically we're not sort of seeing that. Again, think of it as just there's the activity, and then there's supporting documentation, usually at a summary level going into TraceCarbon, at least today.
I want to say thank you very much, Kieren. It was awesome to see, and it's just great. Obviously, it's a great initiative to be getting off the ground here, and I look forward to seeing it develop over the coming months and years.
Thanks, Connor.